Hey everybody, it is Wintermute coming to you from the think tank. So I want to delve into a house rule that I've been bouncing around in my head for a while, and I finally went ahead and put pen to paper on it. And it is about recruitment rules. Now the basic rules regarding recruitment in the game are fine. I don't actually have a problem with them. I actually think that's actually one of those really innovative ideas that was brought into this game that I'm like, oh, man, that makes a lot of sense, keeps things simple, and keeps things moving straight forward. And there's a couple of mechanics that have been introduced. Actually, there's numerous mechanics that were introduced in this dudes on a map style game centered around World War II that I really, really like. And recruitment is one of them. But I also think that maybe recruitment can be taken one or two steps further to account for kind of other factors that are going on with some of these nations. And what I mean by that is like, okay, let's take a quick look at probably the most obvious example here. We have, let's say Germany attacks Yugoslavia and fails, and they're not yet at war with Britain. So Yugoslavia doesn't align with Britain. It becomes a controlled minor. Now Yugoslavia would need to roll a 1 on a 12-sided dice to be able to get the 1 infantry or 2 militia. Okay. Now, let's say Germany comes in, let's say they come in to take Yugoslavia, and then on the following turn they attack Greece. And for whatever reason, they're still not at war with Britain. So Greece does not align with Britain. Now Greece, and then Greece actually fights off the Germans again, because the Germans are just obviously having a really bad game. And so now Greece is a controlled minor, because he's still not at war with Britain. Germany's still not at war with Britain. And now Greece has 4 land zones under its control. So they would be able to recruit a guy or 2 infantry on a 1 through 4. And you're probably already kind of seeing where I kind of think that's a little weird, a little off. And probably unintentionally so. Because if you look at Greece, well, I even looked this up. At this point in history, Greece had about 7 million inhabitants, citizens. Yugoslavia was about 23 million. So Yugoslavia has like 3 times the population. And yet it's far less likely to recruit an infantry or 2 militia than Greece. Just, as with the rules as written. And again, I don't have a problem with the rules. I'm just saying that I think that this is a more interesting way to handle them. The other difference is Yugoslavia was far more industrialized than Greece was. And you can see that just by looking at the IPP value of Yugoslavia is 3, and Thessaly in Greece is only 1. So I'm like, okay, well, that's what if the recruitment role was also further modified by what the IPP value of that territory is to a minimum of 1. Meaning if there is no IPP value, then obviously it's a single territory, then it's still a 1. So that means doing that, Yugoslavia would recruit on a 1 through 4, and Greece would recruit on a 1 through 5, because it actually has 4 territories and then a IPP, and Yugoslavia is 1 territory, but it's worth 3 IPP, which I think is, now that still gives a slight advantage to Greece, but yeah, whatever. I think that's a little more realistic, though, given the what I know about those 2 countries. Now, of course, I will say this: the recruitment role isn't, and we put down an infantry or 2 militia, and there's a wide berth of possibility with what that militia or that infantry represents. It doesn't necessarily just represent infantry with guns. It can also represent, in most of these minor countries, also represents what meager air force they have, or what minor tanks they had, because a lot of these countries had tanks. They just didn't have a lot of tanks, and they didn't necessarily have enough tanks to justify putting down an actual tank unit on the board. So even if you are looking at like a really small country, And it gets that role. That one infantry that it gets, it could mean, okay, it's half the size of a normal infantry unit, but then it also has some one or two supporting tank battalions and about 30 aircraft supporting it. So really, that's why instead of being just a single militia, it's uprated to an infantry. So it doesn't have to be. You don't have to be very literal with what a lot of this represents. And I'm just saying that as a point of kind of like, you don't be too literal about all the units on the board. I fall into that trap sometimes, and I've even made the argument, about should this unit be included, because I know this was an actual unit, an actual type of vehicle used in the game, and then a buddy of mine said, well, but they wouldn't normally have those as a separate division. They're dispersed. I'm like, out amongst the infantry to support the unit. I'm like, okay, that makes sense. So we really don't need to introduce a whole new unit. But in this case, so back to my original point, it's not always just dudes with guns. So here's how I wrote up the base. I've got two versions of what I would suggest for modifications to the recruitment roles. I've got the basic and the advanced. So the basic is basically just, let me see if I can't get this in frame here. When any non-player nation makes a recruitment roll, the target number is equal to the number of land zones it currently controls plus the total IPP value of those land zones. Additionally, add a +1 to the target number for each minor factory it currently controls, +2 for each medium, +3 for each major. Add another +2 if the recruiting nation liberated one of its original land zones during this turn. So, now I know there are no other, with the exception of Bohemia, there's no other nations out there that have anything other than a minor factory. But I wrote it that way just for thoroughness, in case that changes in a later versions or additions or expansions that come out. This way we're just sort of covered. And it also kind of makes sense in that, if the nation has an actual minor factory, it's more likely to be able to produce the equipment that needs to supply people and guys and all that to get them out there. Also, for the case of, like, let's say Greece, Germany comes in and takes Thessaly. The hand of God comes down and sweeps aside the German units, and there's one guy left there, and the Greeks do a long shot to take Thessaly back, and they come and retake it. Well, not only do they retake that territory, but that's kind of a morale boost. So I would think it would be easier to get more people and more likely to sign people up and to join the military. Hey, we can do this. Let's protect our country. We had a victory. Let's ride that for what it's worth. So that's why I added that bonus for if it can manage to, a controlled minor can manage to retake one of its original territories. Let's see. And then I also clarified, units brought into play from a successful recruitment roll may be placed into any land zone the recruiting nation possessed since the beginning of the turn, or into any sea zone adjacent to a land zone the recruiting nation possessed since the beginning of the turn. When multiple units are recruited in a single place units phase, they do not need to be placed onto the same land or sea zone. Okay, let me clarify something there. I mentioned naval units for the advanced rules. This is still going to be basic. If you make the roll, it's still an infantry or 2 militia. And I also, just clarified that, let's say you choose 2 militia and you're Greece, you can put one militia here and one militia here. They don't necessarily have to go into the same territory, assuming you've controlled them since the beginning of the turn. I also went on to clarify that the basic rules will apply to both factions in the Spanish Civil War. They, however, do not apply to the CCP. Okay, and there's a very specific reason for this. Now, first, let me talk about the Spanish Civil War. I went back and forth as to whether I thought I should try to apply these to the Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, and ultimately I said, yeah, let's do that. I don't think it will be a huge game changer. With the basic rules, basically it starts out equal in that both sides start with 1 IPP here, 1 IPP here. Although the Republicans will have a slight advantage because they have a minor factory here in Madrid. I don't think that's a huge deal, personally. As a matter of fact, I think that the Republicans are always under the gun when it comes to the Civil War. And I'm not trying to make this 50-50. I don't think it doesn't need to be, nor should it be 50-50. But they lose so often that I'm okay throwing them a bone. And I do know that the rules have been rewritten a little bit for lend-leasing to one of these factions from the or lend-leasing to the Republicans from the Allies, in that they can send like a unit. That's one of the other players was explaining that to me. So I know that's also kind of throwing a little bone, giving a little bit more of a chance, and that's fine. And like I said, it shouldn't necessarily be 50-50, but I do think that in general the Republicans could use a little bit of a hand. So that was one of the reasons I was okay with, giving them a slight edge when it comes to that. So there's that. And the reason why I don't feel it should apply to the CCP is because the CCP actually collects income. So those $2 that they get, they're actually spending on stuff. But these other nations are, they don't collect, Yugoslavia doesn't collect money, Greece doesn't collect money to build stuff. So it's, that's why I cut the CCP out of this basically completely. None of this stuff would apply to them. So now let's go to the advanced rules. Okay, so with the advanced rules, you follow all the basic rules. Additionally, if a nation makes a successful recruitment roll, the controlling player may choose which unit it receives from the list below. The controlling player may pick any units listed in the entry for the nation's current IPP value or below. So if it has no income, it's still at the 1 infantry or 2 militia. So that it's always going to have that option. If it has an IPP value of 1, then instead of the 1 infantry or the 2 militia, you could instead choose a cavalry, 1 mountain infantry, or 1 marine infantry. Now, the reason I went ahead and added marine infantry to this list is because the Marines do actually have a land-based bonus in that they don't get penalized for going over rivers. And I figured, there might be, and I didn't comb the map for examples, but there might be some places where maybe a player goes, oh, you know what, that is actually, I'll take the Marine because I'm going to be trying to go over the river. So I figured, it's not going to hurt anything to add that to the list. So basically, if the nation that makes the roll is at an income of 1, then they have 5 different options to pick from. Now, if there are 2 or greater, they get they can choose a motorized infantry, 1 artillery, or 1 anti-aircraft artillery. If they're at a 3, they can choose a light armor or a tank destroyer. If they're at 4, they're 1 infantry plus 1 militia, 3 militia, or 1 torpedo boat destroyer. And then if they're 5 or greater, 1 fighter, 1 destroyer, 1 seaplane, 1 air or naval transport. And I did make the stipulation, the advanced rules will apply to both factions in the Spanish Civil War event. They, however, do not apply to the CCP. Okay, now, one thing I want to clarify with that list is as far as I could see, there's no minor nation on the map, with one exception, that ever has more than 3 income. And that being the Netherlands being the one exception. So that's why I went ahead and made the list from 1 to 3, and then I added a 4 because in theory, a controlled nation might be able to take another territory with some IPV value and get it to bring them up to a 4, and then a 5 or better would basically be, if that nation got lucky and took an expensive territory, or if like the Netherlands being the real one there, why that final entry is there. So what this does is it gives the game a lot more variability in dealing with those minor nations. They're less likely to just be there to die. If they can survive, maybe they can, do something impressive. It takes advantage of what's already on the board. And some of these nations, and I've read up on a lot of these nations and what they were doing, and a lot of these nations they did have access to light armor. They did have an air force. They were not obviously up to par with most of the other major powers, but they did have modern technology by the standards of that day. They just didn't have vast quantities of it. But I wanted to kind of represent, and there's some examples for why I think this is another argument for giving the minor powers options to have more units available to them as options. And I can give you two examples. For one, Sweden actually had put in an order for like 300 airplanes to the Allied nations prior to the breakout of World War II. I want to say only about 30 were delivered before Germany went in and cut them off by taking out Norway and Denmark. And with that, it isolated them, and they could not continue to get that. Although they did still manage to get some through, and they still managed to build the Air Force up a little bit throughout the war. And then, of course, the Netherlands, they actually were buying American-built planes to be stationed down in the Far East Indies prior to the breakout of the war. Now, of course, once the war broke out, Japan came down, took the Money Islands, and America couldn't deliver them. But, they were in the pipeline. Some of them were about to be delivered, and if some hadn't already been delivered. So if the war had gone on a little bit longer, or if Japan had waited a little bit longer, there might actually be the ability to put some more kind of units on the board down there for some of those lesser power or minor powers, minor nations. So there's a lot more going on than just, okay, it's a minor nation, it only has infantry, maybe cavalry. Okay, maybe one or two of these guys have a plane or something. They're now, a lot of, like I said, a lot of these assets don't necessarily amount to having a whole other unit, like a fighter unit on the board. Then again, maybe it does, because Switzerland had about 100 airplane during the war. Now, per the definition in the rule book about how much that actually represents when in fighter units, maybe not it doesn't represent a full piece on the board. But on the other hand, sometimes you round up just to make the game more interesting. And that's an example where I think maybe it should be rounded up. Maybe give Switzerland a fighter unit. That's kind of another discussion. Now, I will say this with the Netherlands. I think Netherlands need to be handled in a completely different way for reasons I won't even go into here. But I made this list and I wrote these up with the idea that they did not need to interface with any other kind of rule set. You could just kind of play them as is, as I wrote them. So anyway, that is my idea for expanding on the recruitment rules. How do people feel? Do you think I missed something? Do you think I should add something to the list? Do you think it's just a bad idea across the board? Put your opinions below in the comments. And for right now, this is Wintermute signing off.